I stood in my parents' sprawling dining room in Millbrook Heights on Christmas Eve, surrounded by 14 guests and the scent of honey-glazed ham, when my mother handed me something that would shatter my world completely, a grimy floor mop, its tangled strands still dripping with murky water from whatever surface it had last touched. "Since you're here enjoying our hospitality without contributing anything meaningful to this family," she announced loud enough for the entire dinner party to hear, her voice cutting through the soft jazz music and gentle conversation, "you might as well earn your keep like the help. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." My sister Cassandra's laughter rang out sharp and deliberate from across the mahogany table, her designer jewelry catching the light from the crystal chandelier as she leaned back in obvious amusement. "Oh, come on, Mom's right," she said with that practiced cruelty she'd perfected over 34 years of sibling rivalry. "Rachel's single anyway, no husband, no kids, nothing important going on. Cleaning is probably the most useful thing she'll do all year." 14 faces turned toward me in that moment. Some looked embarrassed, others smirked behind their wine glasses, but not a single person defended me. Not one voice rose to say this was inappropriate, cruel, or simply wrong. What they didn't know, what none of them sitting at that elegant table could possibly fathom, was who I really was beneath their casual dismissal. They had no idea that I, Rachel Pemberton, had been quietly paying their mortgage for the past 8 years through a complex web of anonymous financial assistance. They couldn't imagine that the $428,000 I transferred into their accounts over nearly a decade had kept them living in this pristine colonial mansion with its manicured gardens and 3-car garage. They didn't know that the government assistance program that had been covering their health insurance premiums was actually my company's charitable foundation, or that I was the reason they still had their country club membership, their luxury cars, and their comfortable retirement lifestyle. But they were about to discover everything. That night, as snow began falling softly outside their picture-perfect windows, I would walk out of their lives carrying nothing but my purse and their echoing laughter. By Monday morning, I would systematically cancel every payment, every subsidy, every invisible thread of support I'd woven around their existence for 8 long years. By the end of that week, their comfortable world would begin cracking along fault lines they never knew existed, revealing a foundation built entirely on the generosity of the daughter they'd just handed a mop. And when they finally learned the truth about who had been holding their perfect life together, and who had been secretly undermining it from within, the devastation would be absolutely complete. This is the story of how a Christmas mop became the catalyst for revolution, how invisible love transformed into calculated justice, and how the daughter they dismissed as worthless built an empire from their insults while they slept peacefully in beds I'd helped them keep. Trust me, by the end of this tale, you'll understand why that soggy mop now sits preserved behind glass in the lobby of the Pemberton Foundation for Financial Abuse Survivors, bearing a plaque that reads, "Sometimes the tools meant to diminish us become the monuments to our strength." Stay with me, because what unfolds next will leave you questioning everything you think you know about family, loyalty, and the price of being taken for granted. My name is Rachel Pemberton, and I'm 34 years old. For the past 12 years, I've built Cornerstone Financial Recovery, one of the most successful debt counseling and financial rehabilitation companies in the Pacific Northwest, with offices stretching from Seattle to Portland. Most people don't realize the scope of what we do. We've helped over 8,000 families escape crushing debt, rebuilt credit scores for domestic abuse survivors, and created financial independence programs for people trapped in exploitative relationships. But my own family thinks I work some vague office job that barely pays the bills, despite the fact that my face has been on the cover of Pacific Business magazine 3 times and I was named one of Washington State's 40 under 40 entrepreneurs 2 years running. The drive to my parents' house in the exclusive Millbrook Heights neighborhood had taken me 2 hours through increasingly heavy December snow, the kind of early winter storm that transforms the evergreen landscape into something from a holiday postcard. I'd gripped the steering wheel of my understated Honda Civic. I deliberately drove modest cars to family gatherings, and watched the scenery change from my downtown Seattle high-rise district to the manicured suburbs where old money quietly flourished. The GPS announced my arrival just as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Georgian colonial I'd helped save from foreclosure 6 years ago. I'd paid for the new roof after the ice storm damage, funded the kitchen renovation that my mother had attributed to an unexpected insurance settlement, and covered the cost of refinishing the hardwood floors throughout the house. All of it presented as mysterious good fortune because accepting direct help from me would have wounded their pride, though they'd never questioned their remarkable string of financial luck. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Cassandra's pearl-white BMW was already positioned prominently in the circular driveway, taking up the space closest to the front entrance. My sister had always possessed an uncanny ability to claim the best of everything before anyone else arrived: the best parking spot, the best seat at dinner, the best slice of attention from our parents. I pulled my sensible sedan behind her husband Derek's Mercedes SUV and sat for a moment, watching through the frosted windows as warm golden light spilled from every window of the house. I could see silhouettes moving inside, hear the faint sounds of Christmas music and conversation drifting across the snow-covered lawn. For just one moment, I allowed myself to imagine walking through that front door and being greeted with genuine enthusiasm, with questions about my business successes, with interest in the humanitarian work that had become my life's passion. Then I grabbed my overnight bag from the back seat and walked carefully across the icy driveway to the mahogany front door adorned with an elaborate evergreen wreath that had probably cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. My mother opened the door before I could knock, her face arranged in that familiar expression I'd learned to decipher over 34 years, the one that said my presence was expected but not particularly welcomed. "Oh, Rachel, you're here," she said, adjusting her pearl necklace with manicured fingers. Cassandra arrived at noon to help with preparations. "She's been such a blessing today." The implied criticism hung in the December air between us like my visible breath, even though I'd driven through a snowstorm and arrived exactly when they'd requested. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and roasted chestnuts, like childhood memories viewed through someone else's family videos. Cassandra appeared from the kitchen wearing a silk burgundy dress that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, her professionally highlighted hair styled in perfect waves that required the kind of salon maintenance I'd been secretly funding through her credit card payments for 3 years. "Rachel, finally," she air-kissed near my cheek, her expensive perfume cloying and overwhelming. "We were starting to worry the snow had trapped you somewhere. Mom's been telling everyone about the European river cruise she and Dad are taking next spring, you know, the one through the Rhine Valley." She linked her arm through mine in a gesture that appeared affectionate but felt proprietary, leading me toward the living room where at least a dozen guests were already settled with cocktails and appetizers. What none of them knew, what they couldn't possibly imagine as they sipped wine from crystal glasses I'd purchased as their anniversary gift 5 years ago, was the intricate financial architecture I'd built around their lives. They saw comfortable retirement funded by careful savings and smart investments. The reality was that their savings had been depleted 8 years ago when my father's construction company collapsed during the housing market crash, leaving them with crushing debt and facing bankruptcy at age 62. I'd stepped in through a carefully constructed network of shell companies and charitable foundations, making their mortgage payments appear to come from a community assistance program for displaced workers. Their health insurance premiums, $2,400 monthly for comprehensive coverage, showed up on their statements as subsidies from a seniors wellness initiative that existed only on paper and in my accounting books. The country club membership they treasured, the one that maintained their social status in Millbrook Heights, was funded through my company's Executive Retreat Partnership program, another fiction designed to protect their pride while keeping them afloat. Cassandra's children attended Whitmore Preparatory Academy, one of the state's most exclusive private schools, on full scholarships from the Academic Excellence Foundation, a charitable organization I'd created specifically to funnel $36,000 annually toward their education without her ever knowing the money came from her dismissed sister. Her BMW payments, her mortgage on the trendy downtown townhouse, even her weekly spa appointments were all invisibly subsidized through various channels I'd established over the years. But the scope of my hidden support went far beyond simple bill paying. When my father needed emergency heart surgery 2 years ago, the experimental treatment coverage that saved his life came from a medical research grant I'd funded personally. When my mother's prescription drug costs skyrocketed after her diabetes diagnosis, the pharmaceutical assistance program that made her medications affordable was my money channeled through a network of healthcare foundations. I'd even orchestrated their social rehabilitation after my father's business failure. The investment opportunities that had miraculously appeared, allowing them to rebuild their retirement portfolio, were actually carefully structured loans from my company disguised as market gains. The consulting work that gave my father purpose and income in his supposed retirement came from contracts I'd negotiated with my business associates, who hired him as a favor to me while believing they were simply supporting a fellow entrepreneur's family member. Standing in their elegantly appointed living room, watching my father pour scotch from a crystal decanter I'd anonymously gifted them last Christmas, I calculated the true scope of my invisible generosity. Over 8 years, I'd transferred approximately $428,000 directly and indirectly into their lives: mortgage assistance, insurance coverage, medical bills, educational expenses, lifestyle maintenance, and crisis intervention. $428,000 that had kept them living like successful retirees while I was dismissed as the unsuccessful daughter who couldn't even manage to get married or provide them with grandchildren. They credited their comfortable circumstances to good planning and a blessed fortune, never questioning how every financial crisis seemed to resolve itself just before reaching catastrophic proportions. They accepted every anonymous gift, every mysterious assistance program, every miraculous financial break with the entitled satisfaction of people who believed they deserved good things simply because they were good people. Meanwhile, I lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood, driving a used Honda and shopping at discount stores, funneling the majority of my 7-figure annual income into maintaining their illusion of prosperity. I told myself it was love, that supporting them secretly was more noble than supporting them openly because it protected their dignity. But sitting in their living room, listening to Cassandra describe her latest shopping trip to Milan while our parents nodded approvingly, I began to understand that I'd been enabling their dismissal of me by making their lives so comfortable they never had to acknowledge their dependence. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant, Thomas Chin, back at the Cornerstone offices. The Morrison family settlement came through, another $2.3 million in recovered assets for the Domestic Abuse Survivors Fund. You're changing lives, boss. I looked around at my family's comfortable gathering, at people who thought I was barely surviving financially, and felt the bitter irony of being surrounded by those who knew me least while spending my days helping strangers rebuild their lives from financial exploitation. That's when my mother emerged from the kitchen carrying that grimy mop, and everything I'd carefully constructed over 8 years was about to come crashing down. The weight of that filthy mop in my hands felt heavier than any burden I'd ever carried, its grimy strands dripping murky water onto my black dress shoes while 14 pairs of eyes watched my humiliation unfold in my parents' pristine dining room. I looked down at the crude cleaning tool, then up at my mother's face, which wore an expression of cold satisfaction that I'd never seen before but somehow recognized as something that had always been lurking beneath her polite maternal facade. "Well," she said, her voice carrying across the sudden silence that had fallen over the Christmas gathering. "The kitchen floor won't clean itself, and since you're not contributing anything else meaningful to this family celebration, you might as well make yourself useful in the only way you can." The guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, but their discomfort was nothing compared to the crystalline moment of clarity that struck me like lightning. Standing there in that elegant room, surrounded by people who'd eaten food paid for with my money, sitting on furniture I'd helped them afford, wearing clothes purchased with credit cards I'd been secretly maintaining, I finally understood the fundamental truth I'd been avoiding for 8 years. I wasn't their disappointing daughter who needed to prove her worth through sacrifice. I was their unpaid benefactor who'd been systematically erased from my own story of generosity. I set the mop down carefully against the mahogany dining table, its handle leaving a wet mark on the polished wood surface. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I was marking their perfect facade with evidence of the dirty work they expected me to do while pretending I didn't exist as anything more than convenient labor. "I'm going home," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. The words carried weight I hadn't expected, because for the first time in years, I realized I wasn't entirely sure where home actually was. It certainly wasn't this house where I'd been handed cleaning supplies like hired help. My father looked up from his scotch, his expression more irritated than concerned. "Don't be so dramatic, Rachel. Your mother just asked you to help out a little. Family members pitch in during the holidays." But I was already walking toward the coat closet, my footsteps echoing against the hardwood floors I'd paid to refinish 2 years ago. Behind me, I could hear my mother's voice rising with indignation. "Where do you think you're going? We haven't even served dinner yet, and I've been cooking all day." I turned back one final time, looking at the scene I was leaving, my sister smirking behind her wine glass, my parents staring at me with expressions of offended disbelief, and their guests pretending to study their appetizer plates while obviously listening to every word. "Enjoy your dinner," I said simply. "I hope it's everything you think you deserve." The drive back to Seattle through the December snowstorm gave me 3 hours to process what had just happened and to make decisions that would change everything. My hands shook so violently for the first 20 minutes that I had to pull over at a rest stop, where I sat in my car crying with the kind of raw emotion I'd trained myself to suppress for decades. But these weren't just tears of hurt or humiliation. They were tears of recognition that I'd been complicit in my own erasure, that every anonymous payment and invisible rescue had enabled them to dismiss me as worthless while depending entirely on my worth. I'd thought I was being noble by supporting them secretly, but I'd actually been enabling their cruelty by making it consequence-free. When I finally stopped crying and resumed driving, my mind began working with the cold precision that had built my business from nothing into a multi-million-dollar operation. I opened my phone's voice recorder and began documenting every financial transaction, every anonymous assistance program, every hidden subsidy I'd provided over 8 years. Not for revenge, but for clarity. I needed to understand the full scope of what I was about to walk away from. By the time I reached my Capitol Hill apartment, I had a complete mental inventory of my family's dependence on me. The mortgage payments that would resume in January when my community assistance program mysteriously ended. The health insurance premiums they'd have to cover when their Seniors Wellness Initiative suddenly concluded. The private school tuition that would become due when Cassandra's children lost their Academic Excellence Foundation scholarships. I spent Christmas morning in my small apartment, not opening the modest gifts I'd bought myself, but instead creating spreadsheets that mapped out every invisible thread connecting my bank accounts to their comfortable lives. The numbers were staggering when displayed in neat columns, $428,000 over 8 years, but that didn't include the opportunity costs, the vacations I hadn't taken, the larger apartment I could have afforded, the retirement savings I'd depleted to maintain their illusion of prosperity. On December 26, I drove to my office in downtown Seattle, where the Cornerstone Financial Recovery building stood empty except for security guards. In my corner office with its view of Elliott Bay, I opened my laptop and began the systematic process of canceling my family's invisible safety net. First, I called Jefferson Trust Bank, where I'd established the Millbrook Community Assistance Program that had been covering my parents' mortgage. I informed them that the pilot program was concluding on December 31st, effective immediately. The automatic payments would cease, and the homeowners would need to resume regular mortgage payments beginning January 1st. Next, I contacted Pinnacle Insurance Group and terminated the Pacific Seniors Wellness Initiative that had been subsidizing their health coverage. Their comprehensive insurance would revert to basic Medicare coverage, with prescription drug costs and specialist appointments becoming their responsibility. Then came the most emotionally difficult call, to Whitmore Preparatory Academy, where I dissolved the Academic Excellence Foundation that had been providing full scholarships to Cassandra's children. The school's financial aid director was apologetic but matter-of-fact. Without the scholarship funding, the family would be responsible for the full $36,000 annual tuition beginning with the spring semester. I systematically dismantled 8 years of financial architecture in 4 hours of phone calls, each conversation ending another chapter of my invisible generosity. By evening, my family's financial safety net had been completely removed, though they wouldn't understand what had happened until bills started arriving in January. But ending the payments wasn't enough. I needed them to understand who had been supporting them and why that support was disappearing. I needed them to connect their Christmas Eve cruelty to the January consequences that would follow. Most importantly, I needed to ensure they could never claim ignorance about the source of their comfort or the reason for its withdrawal. That night, I drafted a letter I would never send, but needed to write for my own clarity. It detailed every payment, every assistance program, every financial intervention I'd provided over 8 years. It explained how their blessed fortune had actually been their dismissed daughter working overtime to maintain their dignity while they systematically destroyed hers. But I deleted that letter without printing it. They didn't deserve explanations, and I didn't owe them understanding. What they deserved was to experience the natural consequences of treating their benefactor like hired help, to discover that their comfortable life had been entirely dependent on someone they considered worthless. As I locked my office and drove home through the quiet Seattle streets, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the lightness that comes from setting down a burden you didn't realize you were carrying. For 8 years, I'd been financially responsible for 5 adults who treated me like a failure. Starting January 1st, they would finally experience what failure actually felt like, while I began learning what freedom meant. I just had no idea how quickly their world would begin to crumble, or how desperately they would scramble to understand what had happened when the foundation I'd built beneath their lives simply disappeared. The first sign that something was wrong came on January 3rd, when my mother's panicked voicemail arrived at 7:42 a.m. Pacific Time while I was reviewing quarterly reports in my Seattle office. Her voice, usually controlled and precise, carried an edge of confusion that I'd never heard before. "Rachel, there's been some sort of mistake with our bank account. The mortgage payment was declined, and Jefferson Trust is saying our assistance program has been terminated. I'm getting notices about late fees and something about resuming full payments. This has to be an error. We've never missed a payment in 8 years. Call me back immediately." I saved the message and continued working on my client files, helping families rebuild their financial lives after escaping exploitative relationships. The irony wasn't lost on me that I spent my days teaching people to recognize and escape financial abuse while having voluntarily subjected myself to it for nearly a decade. The second message arrived 4 hours later, this time from my father, and his tone had shifted from confusion to genuine alarm. "Rachel, this is serious. The bank says we owe $347,000 on the house, but that can't be right. We've been making payments through that community program for years. They're threatening foreclosure procedures if we don't bring the account current within 30 days. I don't understand what's happening here." By the third day, Cassandra had left 2 increasingly frantic voicemails. The first was characteristic of her usual dramatic flair. "Rachel, where the hell are you? Mom and Dad are freaking out about some banking error, and now I'm getting calls from Whitmore Academy saying the kids' scholarships have been revoked. They want $18,000 by the end of January or Emma and Jackson will be expelled. This is insane. Scholarships don't just disappear overnight." Her second message, left just after midnight on January 5th, revealed a desperation I'd never heard in my sister's voice. The insurance company called. "Our premium went from $240 to $2,400 a month starting February 1st. Mom's diabetes medications alone cost $800 without the good coverage. Dad's heart medication is another $600. We can't afford this, Rachel. Whatever's happening with these programs ending all at once, it can't be a coincidence. You have to help us figure this out." But I wasn't responding to any of them. Instead, I was discovering something unexpected about freedom. It felt terrifying and exhilarating simultaneously. For the first time in 8 years, my bank account wasn't being systematically drained to maintain other people's lifestyles. My investment portfolio wasn't being liquidated to cover their emergencies. My mental energy wasn't consumed with orchestrating their anonymous assistance programs. Thomas Chen, my assistant, noticed the change immediately when I arrived at work on January 6th wearing a designer suit I'd purchased for myself instead of funneling the money toward my family's endless needs. "You look different," he said, studying my face with the perceptive gaze that made him invaluable in our client work. "Lighter somehow. Did something happen over the holidays?" I nearly told him everything then: the Christmas Eve humiliation, the systematic dismantling of my family's safety net, the messages piling up on my voicemail like evidence of a controlled demolition in progress. But instead, I simply said, I made some difficult but necessary decisions about personal boundaries. Sometimes you have to stop enabling people before they'll acknowledge their dependence. Thomas nodded with understanding that suggested he'd witnessed similar dynamics in our client work. We spend our days helping people recognize the difference between love and exploitation, between family loyalty and financial abuse. The patterns were always the same: generous individuals systematically drained by family members who took everything while giving nothing but criticism in return. That afternoon brought the call I'd been expecting. Mrs. Patricia Whitmore, the headmistress of the prestigious academy Cassandra's children attended, spoke with the diplomatic precision of someone accustomed to handling delicate financial situations among wealthy families. "Ms. Pemberton, I'm calling because the Academic Excellence Foundation scholarship for Emma and Jackson Reynolds has been terminated, and we need to discuss payment arrangements for the spring semester." The family seems to be unaware that their children's full tuition is now due, $36,000 total. Given that classes resume next week, we need immediate resolution. I explained that I was no longer associated with the Academic Excellence Foundation, which was true since I dissolved it entirely. Mrs. Whitmore's silence suggested she was processing the implications of losing such substantial funding with no advance notice. I see, she said finally. This puts us in a difficult position. The Reynolds family has no alternative funding arrangements, and frankly, they seem shocked by the tuition requirements. Would you happen to know of other scholarship opportunities they might pursue? The question hung in the air between us, and I realized this was my first test of resolve. I could easily reinstate the scholarships, create new funding channels, protect Emma and Jackson from the consequences of their parents' financial illiteracy. The children were innocent, after all, and their education shouldn't suffer because their grandmother had handed me a mop. But protecting them would mean resuming the cycle that had consumed 8 years of my life. It would signal to my family that their Christmas Eve treatment of me had no real consequences, that they could humiliate me publicly and still depend on my invisible rescue when problems arose. I'm afraid I can't help with alternative funding, I told Mrs. Whitmore. The family will need to explore their own financial options. Perhaps this situation will encourage them to have honest conversations about their actual resources versus their assumed entitlements. After ending that call, I walked to my office window overlooking Elliott Bay and watched ferries crossing the gray January water. Somewhere 20 miles south in Millbrook Heights, my family was experiencing their first taste of financial reality in nearly a decade. The mortgage company was calculating late fees. The insurance company was preparing to reduce their coverage. The private school was updating its records to reflect 2 students whose academic careers suddenly hung in financial limbo. But the most significant change wasn't happening in their bank accounts, it was happening in their understanding of their own situation. For 8 years, they'd lived with the comfortable certainty that they were prosperous retirees whose careful planning had earned them a secure future. Now they were discovering that their prosperity had been entirely artificial, their security completely dependent on an anonymous benefactor they'd never bothered to identify or thank. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Derek, Cassandra's husband. She's having a panic attack about the school situation. The kids are asking why they might have to leave Whitmore. We need to talk. Can you call me? I deleted the text without responding. Derek had been present at Christmas Eve dinner, had watched his mother-in-law hand me a mop, and had said nothing. He'd benefited from my anonymous generosity for 3 years while treating me like an unsuccessful spinster whose opinions on anything were irrelevant. If he wanted help now, he could start by acknowledging what had actually been happening and who had been providing it. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I made dinner plans with friends who knew nothing about my family drama but everything about my professional success. Sitting in a downtown Seattle restaurant, listening to colleagues discuss our upcoming expansion into Oregon and California, I felt the deep satisfaction of being seen and valued for my actual accomplishments rather than dismissed for my perceived failures. When I finally checked my voicemail at 10 p.m., there were 7 new messages from Millbrook Heights. Each one revealed another crack in their financial facade, another moment when comfortable assumptions collided with harsh realities. They were beginning to understand that their blessed fortune had actually been carefully orchestrated assistance, but they still had no idea who had been orchestrating it. That would change soon enough. But first, I wanted them to fully experience what their lives looked like without me in them, invisible or otherwise. The turning point came on January 12th, when I received an overnight delivery package at my Seattle office that I hadn't been expecting. The return address showed Whitmore and Associates Legal Services, from Millbrook Heights, and my heart rate accelerated as I signed for it, wondering if my family had somehow discovered my role in their financial collapse and decided to pursue legal action. Inside the thick manila envelope, however, was something far more devastating than any lawsuit, a letter from my mother's attorney, dated 3 days earlier, along with several documents that would rewrite everything I thought I knew about my family's history and my place in it. The cover letter was brief and professionally distant. Ms. Pemberton, per your mother's instructions given to me in 2019, I am to deliver the enclosed materials to you in the event of significant family financial distress or if she becomes unable to manage her affairs. Based on recent developments reported to me by your parents, it appears both conditions have been met. Please review these documents carefully, as they contain information your mother felt you should know under these circumstances. With trembling hands, I opened the sealed inner envelope marked, "For Rachel only," in my mother's precise handwriting. What I found inside shattered every assumption I'd held about why my family had treated me differently my entire life. The first document was a medical report from Millbrook Heights General Hospital, dated 35 years ago, my birth record. But this wasn't the birth certificate I'd seen before. This was the complete medical file, including a paternity test performed when I was 3 days old. According to the lab results, Jonathan Pemberton, the man I'd called Dad my entire life, was not my biological father. The second document was a handwritten letter from my mother, dated just 4 years ago, apparently written during one of her diabetic episodes when she thought she might not survive. Her careful script revealed the truth she'd been hiding for over 3 decades. "Rachel, if you're reading this, something has forced me to finally tell you what I should have told you years ago. Your father, your biological father, was a man named David Thornfield, whom I met during a brief separation from Jonathan when you were conceived. David was kind, intelligent, and completely devoted to the idea of family in ways that Jonathan never was. When I realized I was pregnant, David begged me to leave Jonathan permanently and start a new life with him. But I was terrified of the scandal, of losing the social status and financial security that Jonathan represented in our community." The letter continued with details that made my chest tighten with recognition. David respected my decision to stay with Jonathan, but he made me promise that if you ever needed anything, education, medical care, opportunities, I would contact him. When you graduated valedictorian from high school and Jonathan refused to help with college expenses because girls don't need degrees, I reached out to David. He immediately established a scholarship fund that covered your entire undergraduate education. When you started your business and needed capital, the anonymous investor who provided your initial funding was David, channeling money through business associates to maintain his promise not to interfere in our lives directly. I stared at the letter, my mind racing through memories of the mysterious scholarship that had appeared just when I needed it, the early business investment that had seemed too good to be true, the sense I'd always had that someone was watching over my career from a distance. But the most devastating revelation was still to come. David died 2 years ago from a sudden heart attack. In his will, he left everything to you: his business, his properties, his investments. The executor has been trying to reach you, but I intercepted all communications because I was terrified of what you learning the truth might mean for our family. The inheritance is substantial, Rachel. Over $4 million, plus his successful consulting firm and commercial real estate holdings worth another $3 million. My hands shook as I processed this information. While I'd been secretly supporting my family with money from my own business, I'd had a $7 million inheritance waiting for me that my mother had deliberately concealed. The executor's contact information was included in the packet, along with a note indicating that the estate had been in probate for 2 years while they searched for me. The third document was even more shocking, a detailed financial investigation that my mother had apparently commissioned in 2020, tracking all the anonymous assistance programs that had been supporting their lifestyle. She'd hired a private investigator to identify their mysterious benefactor, and the results were comprehensive and damning. The report clearly identified me as the source of every payment, every assistance program, every financial intervention over 8 years. She had known. For 4 years, my mother had known that I was the one paying their mortgage, their insurance, their children's education. She'd known and had said nothing, allowing me to sacrifice my own financial security while they dismissed me as unsuccessful. She'd watched me drive modest cars and live in a small apartment while funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars toward their comfortable lifestyle. But the final document was what broke me completely, a copy of their will, updated just 6 months ago. In it, they left everything to Cassandra, for her devotion and constant support of our family, with a single paragraph about me. To our daughter Rachel, we leave our gratitude for her occasional visits and our hope that she will find greater success in life than she has achieved thus far. I sat in my office chair, surrounded by the wreckage of everything I'd believed about my family relationships, and felt a rage unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not only had they known about my financial support and chosen to hide their knowledge, but they'd actively planned to exclude me from any inheritance while rewarding the daughter who had contributed nothing except expectation and entitlement. Thomas found me there an hour later, still holding the documents and staring out at Elliott Bay with tears streaming down my face. "Rachel? What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I have," I said quietly. "I've seen the ghost of the daughter who spent 8 years trying to earn love from people who already knew her worth and chose to exploit it instead of acknowledge it." I handed him the documents and watched his expression change as he read through the revelations. "Jesus Christ," he whispered when he finished. "They've known for 4 years that you were supporting them? And they never said anything? They just kept taking your money while treating you like a failure?" I nodded, feeling strangely calm now that the initial shock was wearing off. "It gets worse. Apparently, my biological father left me a $7 million inheritance that my mother has been hiding from me for 2 years. While I was draining my own accounts to pay their bills, I had enough money sitting in probate to buy their house 10 times over." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, processing the scope of the deception. Finally, he looked up at me with something approaching awe. "What are you going to do?" I stood up and walked to my window, looking down at the Seattle streets where people were going about their normal lives, unaware that someone's entire world had just been rebuilt from the foundation up. "I'm going to contact the estate executor and claim my inheritance. I'm going to expand our business using my biological father's money and resources. And then I'm going to drive to Millbrook Heights and have a very interesting conversation with my family about the difference between what they thought they knew and what they actually knew." "Are you going to tell them about the inheritance?" I smiled for the first time since opening the package. "Oh, I'm going to tell them everything. About David Thornfield, about the money they stole from my future by hiding his death, about the private investigator report that proves they've been exploiting my generosity while pretending not to know where it came from. But first, I want them to spend a few more weeks wondering where their comfortable life went and why no mysterious assistance programs are emerging to save them this time." The anger I felt wasn't the hot, destructive kind that demands immediate action. It was cold, calculated fury that wanted perfect justice delivered with surgical precision. They'd had 4 years to acknowledge my support and chose silence. They'd had 2 years to inform me of my inheritance and chose concealment. Now they would discover what it felt like when someone who truly understood their situation decided to stop protecting them from the consequences of their own choices. But first, I had a phone call to make to an estate executor in Portland, Oregon, who had been wondering for 2 years why a $7 million inheritance was going unclaimed. The estate offices of Thornfield and Associates occupied the top floor of a glass tower in downtown Portland, Oregon, and as I rode the elevator to the 23rd floor 3 days after receiving my mother's devastating documents, I felt like I was ascending toward a completely different life. The executor, Harrison Walsh, was a distinguished man in his 60s who greeted me with the careful warmth of someone who had been waiting years to deliver life-changing news. "Ms. Pemberton," he said, rising from behind a mahogany desk that could have housed a small family, "I cannot express how relieved I am to finally meet you. We've been searching for you since David Thornfield's death 26 months ago. Your mother intercepted all our communications, claiming she would forward them to you, but apparently she never did." The conference room where he led me overlooked the Columbia River, and spread across the polished table were documents that represented not just money, but the love of a father I'd never known I had. David Thornfield's will was 37 pages long, and every paragraph revealed another layer of his devotion to the daughter he'd watched from a distance for 34 years. The liquid assets alone total $4.2 million, Harrison explained, his voice carrying the gravity of someone who understood the magnitude of what he was revealing. But that's just the beginning. David built Thornfield Consulting into one of the Pacific Northwest's premier corporate restructuring firms. The business is valued at $3.8 million and generates approximately $1.2 million annually in profit. Then there are the real estate holdings, 6 commercial properties in Portland and Seattle worth another $2.1 million combined. I stared at the numbers, calculating that my total inheritance was approaching $8 million. While I'd been sacrificing my own financial security to support people who knew exactly what I was doing and chose to hide their knowledge, I'd had enough money waiting for me to transform my modest consulting firm into a regional powerhouse. But the financial details weren't what broke my heart. It was the personal items Harrison showed me next, a storage unit David had maintained for 30 years, filled with evidence of his love for the daughter he couldn't claim. Newspaper clippings from every academic achievement I'd earned, starting with my middle school science fair victory. Programs from my high school graduation, my college commencement, the business award ceremony where I'd been named Pacific Northwest Entrepreneur of the Year. He attended everything, Harrison said softly, opening a photo album that made my chest tighten with grief for opportunities lost. Graduations, award ceremonies, even some of your early business presentations. He always sat in the back, never approached you, but he documented every moment. He said he wanted you to know someday that you'd never been without a father's pride, even if you didn't know he was there. The photographs showed David Thornfield at dozens of events throughout my life, a tall, distinguished man with graying hair and kind eyes, always positioned where he could see me but remain unnoticed. In one image, taken at my college graduation, I could see myself on stage receiving my diploma while David sat 3 rows back, tears visible on his cheeks even in the grainy photograph. But Harrison's next revelation hit me like a physical blow. David knew about your family's financial situation and your anonymous support of them. He hired investigators to monitor your well-being, and when they reported that you were depleting your own resources to support people who treated you poorly, he wanted to intervene. But he'd promised your mother never to disrupt your family relationships, so instead he channeled additional money through your business without your knowledge. The executor handed me another document that made my hands shake as I read it. For the past 5 years, several of my most lucrative corporate consulting contracts hadn't come through my business reputation alone. David had been quietly recommending my services to his extensive network of business contacts, ensuring I had sufficient income to maintain both my own life and my family's secret support. The Morrison Industries restructuring that launched your expansion? The Cascade Healthcare consolidation that established your regional reputation? The Portland Municipal Pension Fund reorganization that put you on the cover of Pacific Business Magazine? All of them came to you because David convinced decision-makers that you were exactly what they needed, then stepped back and let your talent prove him right. I felt tears starting as I processed the scope of David's invisible support. Not only had he been watching over my career, but he'd been actively facilitating my success while ensuring I never knew about his involvement. He'd managed to support me without undermining my independence or creating the same dynamic of unacknowledged dependence that I'd foolishly established with my family. There's something else, Harrison said, his voice taking on the careful tone lawyers use when delivering information that will change everything. David left detailed instructions about what should happen if you ever discovered that your family had been financially exploiting you or treating you poorly despite your generosity. He anticipated this situation and made provisions for it. He handed me a sealed envelope marked, "For Rachel," when she's ready to choose herself over them. Inside was a letter in David's handwriting, dated just weeks before his death, that showed he'd understood the dynamics of my family better than I'd understood them myself. My dearest daughter, if you're reading this letter, it means you've finally discovered the truth about multiple deceptions, your mother's concealment of my death, their knowledge of your financial support, and possibly their continued exploitation despite knowing where their comfort actually comes from. I want you to know that none of this surprises me, because I've been watching them take advantage of your generous heart for years. You inherited your kindness from me, but you also inherited my business instincts and my sense of justice. Use both now. The money I'm leaving you isn't just an inheritance, it's ammunition for the war you're going to need to fight to reclaim your own life. Don't feel guilty about having resources they don't know about. They forfeited the right to your transparency when they chose deception over honesty. The letter continued with specific suggestions that showed David had been planning for this moment. Expand your business using my resources and client network. By the building your Seattle office is located in, I've already negotiated preliminary purchase terms with the current owners. Hire more staff and extend your services to help other people escape the kind of financial exploitation you've been experiencing. Transform your pain into purpose, but don't feel obligated to save people who chose to abuse your salvation. But the final paragraph of David's letter contained the most liberating words I'd ever read. You owe them nothing, Rachel. Not explanation, not continued support, not forgiveness, not even acknowledgement. You've already given them 8 years of your financial life and 34 years of trying to earn love that was never going to be offered freely. You have my permission to choose yourself now. You have my blessing to walk away from people who love your money more than they love you. Most importantly, you have my resources to build whatever life you want, independent of their approval or their needs. Harrison watched me read the letter twice, then handed me the final documents I needed to sign to claim my inheritance. David also left instructions about Thornfield Consulting. If you want it, the business is yours to run as you see fit. If you prefer to sell it and focus on your own company, he arranged for a management buyout at fair market value. Everything is designed to give you maximum flexibility and minimum obligation to anyone except yourself. As I signed the papers that would transfer $8.2 million and a thriving business into my name, I thought about my family 20 miles away in Millbrook Heights, probably huddled around their kitchen table trying to figure out how to cover a $3,200 mortgage payment they'd never had to make before. They were learning what financial stress felt like while I was discovering what generational wealth felt like. But the money wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was understanding that I'd never been the family failure they'd convinced me I was. I'd been the family success story they'd been too proud to acknowledge and too greedy to appreciate. While they'd been taking credit for careful planning and blessed fortune, I'd been the architect of their entire comfortable existence. Now I had the resources to build something magnificent from the wreckage of their betrayal, and more importantly, I had permission from the Father who'd truly loved me to finally stop trying to earn love from people who were constitutionally incapable of giving it freely. The war David had predicted was about to begin, but I was no longer fighting it as the underfinanced, emotionally depleted daughter trying to prove her worth. I was entering it as a millionaire business owner with nothing left to lose and everything to gain by finally telling the truth. The crisis escalated with breathtaking speed once January's bills started arriving in Millbrook Heights. I monitored the situation from my newly expanded Seattle headquarters, where I'd used part of David Thornfield's inheritance to purchase the entire building that housed Cornerstone Financial Recovery. What had once been a modest office suite was now a 4-story operation with the resources to help hundreds of families escape financial exploitation. Thomas had become my director of operations, and he delivered daily intelligence reports about my family's deteriorating situation with the clinical precision of a war correspondent documenting a controlled demolition. The information came through our network of contacts at banks, insurance companies, and medical facilities throughout the region, not through any illegal surveillance, but through the legitimate business relationships we'd built helping other families navigate similar financial crises. The mortgage situation is critical, Thomas reported during our Monday morning briefing in my corner office overlooking Elliott Bay. Jefferson Trust filed a notice of default on January 25. Your parents have 30 days to bring the account current or face foreclosure proceedings. They owe $347,000, plus late fees and penalties that are accumulating daily. But the mortgage was just the beginning of their cascade of problems. Cassandra's financial world had imploded spectacularly when the private school expelled Emma and Jackson for non-payment. The tuition crisis had forced her to enroll them in public school mid-semester, a social humiliation that rippled through Millbrook Heights' tight-knit community of wealthy retirees who measured status through their children's educational achievements. Cassandra's having daily meltdowns, Thomas continued, reading from notes he'd compiled through our informal network of contacts. Derek's threatening divorce unless she can explain where their money has been going. Apparently, he's discovered credit card debt she's been hiding, over $80,000 in luxury purchases charged against cards he thought were paid off. The health insurance situation was becoming genuinely dangerous. Without their comprehensive coverage, my parents were rationing medications that had become prohibitively expensive. My mother's diabetes supplies alone cost $1,200 monthly without insurance, and my father's heart medications were another $900. According to our contact at Millbrook Heights Pharmacy, they'd switched to generic versions of everything and were skipping doses to make prescriptions last longer. Your mother collapsed at the grocery store last Wednesday, Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of information that felt too personal to deliver clinically. Blood sugar crisis from trying to stretch her insulin. She spent 4 hours in the emergency room, which generated a $3,800 bill they can't pay. The hospital's billing department has been calling daily. I felt a complicated mixture of satisfaction and genuine concern as I processed these updates. Part of me, the part that remembered standing in their dining room holding a filthy mop while they laughed, felt vindicated watching them experience the financial stress I'd been shielding them from for 8 years. But another part, the part that had loved them despite their cruelty, worried about genuine health consequences from their newfound poverty. The most devastating blow came when I learned about my father's desperate attempt to return to work. At 71, with a history of heart problems, he'd taken a part-time position at Harrison's Hardware in downtown Millbrook Heights, stocking shelves and helping customers for $12 an hour. The sight of Jonathan Pemberton, former construction company owner and country club member, wearing a name tag and lifting boxes had become the talk of their social circle. Mrs. Catherine Holbrook saw him there and called it absolutely heartbreaking, Thomas reported, reading from social media posts that Millbrook Heights residents had been sharing with increasing frequency. Apparently, he looks 20 years older than he did at Christmas. People are wondering if they should organize some kind of community assistance fund. The irony was staggering. Their neighbors were considering charity for people who'd been receiving my charity for nearly a decade, but who'd hidden that assistance so effectively that everyone believed their financial collapse had come from nowhere. They'd been too proud to accept direct help from their daughter, but they might accept donations from near strangers who pitied their sudden reversal of fortune. Meanwhile, my own transformation was attracting attention throughout the Pacific Northwest business community. Using David Thornfield's resources and contacts, I'd expanded Cornerstone Financial Recovery into a regional powerhouse with offices opening in Portland and Spokane. The business magazines that had once featured me as a promising local entrepreneur were now writing about my company's rapid growth and innovative approaches to financial rehabilitation. The Seattle Times wants to do a profile piece, Thomas mentioned, handing me a media request that had arrived that morning. They're calling you the hidden force behind the region's most successful financial recovery stories. They want to focus on how you've helped over 2,000 families escape debt and exploitation. I set the request aside, not because I wasn't proud of our work, but because I wasn't ready for the kind of public attention that might reach Millbrook Heights before I was prepared for the confrontation that was coming. My family needed to experience a few more weeks of genuine financial desperation before they could fully appreciate what they'd lost by treating their benefactor like hired help. But the crisis that would force my hand arrived on February 8th, when Thomas burst into my office with an urgency I'd never seen from him before. "Rachel, we have a problem. Your mother's in intensive care at Millbrook Heights General. Diabetic ketoacidosis from medication rationing. She's been unconscious for 6 hours." The blood drained from my face as I processed this information. I'd wanted them to experience financial consequences for their treatment of me, but I'd never intended for those consequences to become life-threatening. Despite everything they'd done, I didn't want my mother to die from trying to save money on insulin I could easily afford to provide. "There's more," Thomas continued grimly. "The hospital's demanding a $50,000 deposit before they'll continue intensive care treatment. Without insurance authorization, they're classifying her as a self-pay patient. Your father's at the admissions office right now, begging them to work out a payment plan." I stood at my office window, looking out at the Seattle skyline while my conscience battled with my anger. My mother was dying from pride, her pride in hiding my support, her pride in concealing my inheritance, her pride in treating me like a failure while depending entirely on my success. But she was still dying, and I still had the power to save her. "What's our legal exposure if I intervene?" I asked Thomas, my mind already calculating options. "None," he replied immediately. "You're under no obligation to provide medical support for people who've been financially exploiting you. Legally and ethically, you're completely protected. But morally, it's more complicated," I finished. "Because I'm not them. I don't let people die to prove a point, even when they've spent years proving they don't deserve my help. I made my decision with the same clinical precision I'd used to build my business empire. I would save my mother's life, but not anonymously this time. Not through mysterious assistance programs or charitable foundations that allowed them to maintain their illusions about their own prosperity. This time, they would know exactly who was rescuing them and why, and they would face the complete truth about every dollar they'd received over the past 8 years. "Call the hospital," I told Thomas. "Tell them Rachel Pemberton will guarantee all medical expenses for Margaret Pemberton's treatment. Then book me a flight to Portland. It's time to drive to Millbrook Heights and have that conversation I've been postponing." "All of it?" Thomas asked. "The inheritance, the hidden support, the private investigator report?" I smiled grimly as I reached for my coat. "All of it. They've had 2 months to wonder where their comfortable life went. Now they're going to learn who built it, who destroyed it, and why they'll never get it back." The war David Thornfield had predicted was about to begin in earnest, but it would be fought in a hospital room where truth and consequences would finally converge in ways my family could no longer ignore or deny. The drive from Portland to Millbrook Heights took 2 hours through February rain that matched my turbulent emotional state perfectly. I'd made this journey countless times over the years, always arriving as the dismissed daughter hoping for scraps of acknowledgement. This time, I was arriving as a millionaire business owner armed with complete knowledge of their deceptions and the financial power to expose every lie they'd built their comfortable lives upon. Millbrook Heights General Hospital sat on a hill overlooking the town's pristine neighborhoods, its modern facade gleaming despite the gray afternoon drizzle. As I walked through the automatic doors carrying a leather portfolio containing 8 years of financial documentation, I felt the weight of transformation that had occurred over the past month. I was no longer the woman who'd been handed a mop at Christmas dinner. I was David Thornfield's daughter, heir to his business empire and his sense of justice. The intensive care unit occupied the hospital's 4th floor, and the elevator ride gave me time to prepare for what would be the most consequential conversation of my life. When the doors opened, I saw my father immediately, slumped in a plastic chair outside room 417, looking every one of his 71 years plus several more. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair uncombed, and his hands shook slightly as he held a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold hours ago. He looked up when he heard my footsteps on the polished floor, and his face went through a series of expressions: surprise, relief, confusion, and something that might have been shame. "Rachel," he said, standing with obvious effort. "Thank God you're here. I tried calling you, but your number's been disconnected. How did you know about your mother?" "I know about everything," I said simply, sitting down across from him in the sterile waiting area. "The question is how much you know, and how much you've been pretending not to know." Before he could respond, Dr. Sarah Chin emerged from my mother's room, her expression carrying the careful neutrality that medical professionals maintain when delivering serious news. "Mr. Pemberton? I have an update on your wife's condition." "I'm Rachel Pemberton," I interrupted, standing and extending my hand. "Margaret's daughter. I understand you need financial authorization before continuing treatment." Dr. Chen's relief was visible as she shook my hand. "Yes, we've stabilized her blood sugar levels, but she needs several more days of intensive monitoring. The total cost will likely exceed $75,000, and without insurance coverage." "Money isn't an issue," I said, pulling out my checkbook with deliberate ceremony. "I'll guarantee all expenses related to her treatment. Please proceed with whatever care she needs." My father stared as I wrote a check for $25,000 as an initial deposit, his mouth opening and closing without sound. When Dr. Chen left to process the payment, he finally found his voice. "Rachel, how do you have that kind of money?" "Your business. I mean, we thought you were struggling financially." I settled back into my chair and opened the leather portfolio, spreading documents across the small waiting room table like evidence at a trial. "Dad, let's talk about what you thought versus what you actually knew. Let's start with this." I handed him the private investigator's report that my mother had commissioned in 2020, watching his face as he read through the detailed documentation of my anonymous financial support over 8 years. His hands trembled as he turned pages that outlined every payment, every assistance program, every intervention I'd provided while they treated me like their unsuccessful daughter. "You hired an investigator to find your mysterious benefactor," I said quietly. "And when you discovered it was me, you decided to keep taking my money while continuing to treat me like a failure. For 4 years, you've known exactly who was paying your mortgage, your insurance, your grandchildren's education. And you said nothing." My father's face had gone pale, but I wasn't finished. I handed him the estate documents from David Thornfield, watching his expression change from confusion to shock to something approaching horror as he processed the information about my biological parentage and $7 million inheritance. "While I was draining my own savings to support you, I had millions of dollars sitting in probate because Mom intercepted all communications from the estate executor. She knew my biological father was dead, knew he'd left me everything, and chose to hide that information while watching me sacrifice my own financial security for your comfort." "Rachel, He started, but I held up my hand. "I'm not finished. This is the part where you learn about Cassandra." I pulled out bank records showing the systematic theft I'd discovered, forged checks, unauthorized credit card charges, the fraudulent refinancing that had extracted $120,000 from their home equity. Your precious daughter, the one you've always favored, has been stealing from you for years. While I was secretly supporting you, she was secretly robbing you. My father studied the documents with growing disbelief. These signatures, these aren't mine. But how did she? Practice, I said simply. Years of practice forging your signature on checks, documents, whatever she needed to fund her lifestyle while you thought she was just a devoted daughter who visited often. The revelation about Cassandra's theft seemed to affect him more deeply than learning about my support or my inheritance. His face crumpled as he realized that every assumption he'd held about his family dynamics had been completely wrong. The daughter he'd praised was a criminal, the daughter he'd dismissed was a millionaire philanthropist. The Christmas dinner, he whispered, probably remembering the mop incident that had started this cascade of revelations. When your mother handed you that mop, you'd been paying our mortgage for 8 years. 8 years, I confirmed. $428,000 in direct support, plus another $200,000 in indirect assistance through scholarships, insurance supplements, and emergency medical coverage. You handed me a cleaning tool and told me to earn my keep while I was literally keeping you from foreclosure. Dr. Chen returned with payment confirmation and an update on my mother's condition. She was conscious and asking for me. I gathered my documents and stood to enter her room, but my father grabbed my arm with surprising strength. Rachel, what happens now? To us, I mean. To our family. I looked down at this man who'd raised me without loving me, who'd benefited from my generosity while denying my worth, who participated in hiding my inheritance while watching me sacrifice my own security for his comfort. The answer came easily. There is no us anymore, Dad. There's me, building a life with people who value what I contribute. And there's you, learning to live with the consequences of your choices. The money stops today. The anonymous assistance programs are permanently discontinued. The insurance subsidies, the mortgage payments, the educational scholarships, all of it ends now. But the house, we'll lose everything. You'll lose everything I gave you, I corrected. What you'll keep is what you actually earned, which apparently isn't much. But don't worry, I'm sure the community will organize assistance for the poor elderly couple who've fallen on such mysterious hard times. As I walked toward my mother's room, my father called out one last desperate question. Can't we work something out? Some kind of arrangement? I turned back to him, this broken man who'd just learned that his entire comfortable retirement had been funded by the daughter he'd never appreciated. You had 8 years to work something out, Dad. You chose exploitation over acknowledgement. Now you get to live with that choice. Inside room 417, my mother lay connected to various monitors, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. But her eyes were alert when I entered, and I could see recognition and fear in her expression as she realized what my presence here meant. Hello, Mom, I said, sitting beside her bed. We need to talk about David Thornfield, about private investigators, and about the difference between what you knew and what you pretended not to know. And this time, you're going to tell me the complete truth about everything. The reckoning I'd been building toward for 2 months was finally about to begin, and this time there would be no mops, no dismissals, and no way for them to avoid facing exactly who they'd been dealing with all along. The hospital room fell silent except for the steady beeping of monitoring equipment as my mother and I stared at each other across a chasm of 34 years of deception. She looked fragile in the hospital bed, her usually perfect hair limp against the white pillowcase, but her eyes held the same calculating intelligence that had orchestrated decades of manipulation. You know, she said finally, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube that had been removed hours earlier. About David. About the money. About everything. I know that you've been lying to me my entire life, I replied, setting my leather portfolio on the bedside table. But I want to hear you say it. All of it. No more half-truths or strategic omissions. I want the complete story of how you built a family on fraud and exploitation. My mother closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, something had shifted in her expression, a resignation that suggested she'd been carrying this burden for decades and was almost relieved to set it down. David Thornfield contacted me when you turned 18. Said he wanted to help with your college education, that he'd been watching your academic achievements and was proud of what you'd accomplished. She paused, gathering strength for revelations that were clearly painful to voice. I told him you were Jonathan's daughter, that we didn't need help from anyone. But he persisted, said he had legal proof of paternity and would pursue formal recognition if necessary. So we compromised. He could help you financially, but only through anonymous channels that wouldn't disrupt our family. Our family, I repeated bitterly. The family where I was never actually family, just an inconvenient reminder of your affair. You were family, she insisted, though her voice carried no conviction. But you were also complicated. Jonathan agreed to raise you, but he never forgot that you weren't his. Every time he looked at you, he saw my betrayal. And every time I looked at you, I saw my cowardice for choosing security over love. The monitors showed her heart rate increasing as she continued the story that was clearly causing her physical distress. When David died 2 years ago, his executor tried to contact you about the inheritance. I intercepted every communication because I was terrified of what you learning the truth would mean for our stability. If you knew you had millions of dollars, you might stop helping us. You might realize you didn't need our approval anymore. So you let me believe I was financially struggling while sitting on a $7 million inheritance? The rage I felt was so pure it was almost calming. You watched me live in a tiny apartment and drive used cars while I had enough money to buy a mansion? I was protecting our family, she said weakly, but even she seemed to realize how hollow that justification sounded. You were protecting yourself, I corrected. Just like you protected yourself when you hired that private investigator to identify your mysterious benefactor and discovered it was me. I pulled out the investigator's report and held it where she could see it. For years, Mom. For 4 years, you've known I was the one paying your mortgage, your insurance, your comfortable lifestyle. And you said nothing. Her face crumpled as she faced the evidence of her deception. We couldn't acknowledge it without admitting we needed your help. Jonathan's pride couldn't handle being dependent on you. My pride couldn't handle admitting I'd made the wrong choice 35 years ago. So instead, you chose to exploit me while treating me like your greatest disappointment. I opened the portfolio and began laying out bank statements, payment records, and documentation of every financial transaction over 8 years. $428,000, Mom. That's what your pride cost me while you were sitting on millions of dollars that belonged to me. But the revelation that broke her completely came when I showed her the evidence of Cassandra's systematic theft. Bank records showing forged signatures, fraudulent charges, and the refinancing scheme that had stolen $120,000 from their home equity while I'd been supporting them. Your perfect daughter, the one you've always favored, has been robbing you blind for years, I said, watching her face as the scope of Cassandra's betrayal became clear. While I was secretly supporting you, she was secretly destroying you. And you chose to praise her while dismissing me. No, my mother whispered, studying the forged signatures with growing horror. She wouldn't, she's always been so helpful, so attentive. She's been attentive to your bank accounts, I said coldly. Every visit wasn't about family devotion, it was about access to your financial information. Every time she helped you pay bills or organize paperwork, she was learning how to steal from you more effectively. The complete picture of their family dynamics was finally visible, and it was uglier than any of us had imagined. I'd been the secret benefactor while being treated as the family failure. Cassandra had been the secret predator while being celebrated as the devoted daughter. My parents had been the willing victims of both arrangements, too proud to acknowledge the truth about either relationship. What happens now? My mother asked, her voice barely audible above the monitoring equipment. Now you face reality without me cushioning the impact, I replied, standing and gathering my documents. The medical bills from this hospitalization will be covered because I'm not cruel enough to let you die for your pride. But everything else, the mortgage, the insurance, the comfortable retirement you've been living on my money, all of that ends today. We'll lose the house. You'll lose the house I've been paying for while you told everyone I was unsuccessful. You'll lose the lifestyle I've been funding while you dismissed my accomplishments. You'll face the poverty I've been protecting you from while you treated me like hired help. I moved toward the door, then turned back for one final exchange. But you won't lose everything, Mom. You'll still have Cassandra, the daughter you chose to love, the one who's been stealing from you for years. I'm sure she'll be very attentive during your financial crisis, assuming she can figure out how to profit from it. Rachel, please, she called as I reached the doorway. We made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but we're still family. Doesn't that mean anything? I looked back at this woman who'd given birth to me but had never been my mother, who'd hidden my inheritance while exploiting my generosity, who'd chosen pride over love at every crucial moment. It meant everything to me for 34 years, I said quietly. But you taught me that family isn't about blood or obligation, it's about mutual respect and genuine care. You never offered me either of those things. So what now? You just walk away and let us destroy ourselves. I walk away and let you face the consequences of your own choices, I corrected. The same consequences you were happy to let me face when you thought I was broke and struggling. The only difference is that you actually are broke and struggling, while I was secretly millionaire trying to earn love from people constitutionally incapable of giving it. As I left the hospital room, I heard my mother calling my name one last time, but I didn't turn around. In the hallway, I passed my father, who looked up from his plastic chair with desperate hope that died when he saw my expression. The money stops today, I told him simply. All of it. Forever. But we don't know how to live without it, he said, his voice breaking on the admission that he'd never wanted to make. Then you should have learned how to live with acknowledging it, I replied. You had 8 years to say thank you. You chose exploitation instead. Now you get to discover what you actually earned versus what I gave you. Walking through the hospital corridors toward the exit, I felt something I'd never experienced before, the clean satisfaction of perfect justice delivered without cruelty or revenge. They would face the truth about their finances, their relationships, and their choices. They would learn the difference between what they'd assumed they deserved and what they'd actually earned. Most importantly, they would finally understand that the daughter they'd handed a mop was the same person who'd been holding their entire world together, and who had just decided to stop. The reckoning was complete. Now came the transformation that would turn their loss into someone else's gain, their lesson into a legacy that would help thousands of families escape the same kind of exploitation I'd finally learned to walk away from. The war I'd initiated by walking out of that hospital room escalated beyond anything I could have anticipated, transforming from a private family reckoning into a public spectacle that would define the rest of my life. Within 72 hours of my confrontation with my parents, Cassandra launched a counterattack that proved she'd learned more from their years of manipulation than I'd ever realized. She hired Jonathan Blackwell, a personal injury attorney notorious throughout the Pacific Northwest for taking sensational cases and winning through media manipulation rather than legal merit. The lawsuit they filed in King County Superior Court was titled, Elder Financial Abuse and Emotional Manipulation, and the allegations were so explosive they seemed designed more for television cameras than courtroom proceedings. According to the complaint, I had systematically isolated and financially coerced vulnerable elderly parents, threatening to withdraw medical support unless they changed their will in my favor. The filing claimed I'd deliberately caused my mother's diabetic crisis through calculated emotional terrorism, then used her medical emergency to extract confessions about family finances while she was sedated and unable to think clearly. Most damaging was Cassandra's claim that I'd been embezzling from my parents for years through fake charitable programs, creating fraudulent assistance schemes to launder money from their accounts back to myself. She alleged that my anonymous support had actually been a complex theft operation, designed to make them financially dependent while I siphoned off their savings through elaborate shell companies. Blackwell held a press conference on the courthouse steps 3 days after filing, with Cassandra positioned beside him in a simple black dress, minimal makeup, and an expression of devastated dignity that she'd clearly rehearsed for maximum impact. The local television stations led with dramatic headlines: Thanksgiving millionaire accused of elder abuse, and daughter's secret fortune built on parents' exploitation. My client's elderly parents are dying in poverty while their daughter lives in luxury, Blackwell announced to the assembled reporters, his voice carrying that particular blend of outrage and sorrow that trial lawyers perfect over years of practice. This is a case about a wealthy woman who used her resources and business expertise to systematically abuse and exploit the people who raised her, then abandoned them when they were no longer useful to her schemes. The narrative Cassandra constructed was devastatingly effective because it contained just enough truth to seem credible. Yes, I was wealthy while they were struggling financially. Yes, I'd withdrawn support after years of providing it. Yes, they were facing medical and housing crises that I had the power to solve but was choosing not to address. What the media coverage didn't include were the bank records proving my payments had always flowed toward them, never away from them. The private investigator report showing they'd known about my support for years. The estate documents revealing they'd hidden my inheritance while exploiting my generosity. Or the forensic accounting that demonstrated Cassandra's systematic theft of over $200,000 from their accounts. Thomas burst into my Seattle office on the morning after Blackwell's press conference, carrying printouts of online articles and social media posts that showed how quickly the story was spreading. "It's gone viral," he said grimly, spreading newspapers across my conference table. Seattle Times, Portland Tribune, even some national outlets are picking it up. The comments sections are brutal. I read through the coverage with growing disbelief at how skillfully Cassandra had manipulated the narrative. Reader comments ranged from, "How can you abandon elderly parents?" to "Rich people always think money excuses everything," to "This is exactly why successful women are cold and heartless." The few defenders who pointed out inconsistencies in the story were drowned out by the emotional responses to the image of wealthy daughter versus struggling elderly parents. Nobody questioned why parents would need assistance from a daughter they claimed was financially unsuccessful. Nobody wondered why a family would accept anonymous charity for 8 years without trying to identify their benefactor. "There's more," Thomas said reluctantly. "Blackwell's investigators have been contacting your business clients, suggesting that if you'd financially abuse your own parents, you might be exploiting their trust as well. 3 companies have already called to reassess their contracts with us." The attack on my professional reputation hit harder than the personal accusations because it threatened the work I'd built helping families escape exactly the kind of financial exploitation I'd experienced. Cornerstone Financial Recovery employed 47 people whose livelihoods depended on our reputation for integrity and ethical business practices. But Cassandra's most brilliant strategic move came when she filed for emergency guardianship of our parents, claiming they were mentally incompetent and financially vulnerable due to my abandonment and emotional abuse. The petition included affidavits from 2 doctors who'd never treated them, claiming that elderly people who'd suffered financial exploitation were at high risk for cognitive decline and decision-making impairment. If the court grants guardianship, she'll control their medical decisions, their finances, and their communication with the outside world, my attorney, Patricia Wells, explained during an emergency meeting in her downtown Seattle office. She could institutionalize them, sell their house, and manage their affairs with virtually no oversight. It's the perfect way to cover up her own theft while positioning herself as their protector. The guardianship hearing was scheduled for February 28, just 18 days away, and Patricia outlined the legal challenges we faced with the stark honesty that made her one of the region's most respected attorneys. "Cassandra's painted you as the wealthy daughter who abandoned elderly parents in crisis. The judge will see financial records showing you stopped supporting them immediately after they became seriously ill. Without context about their prior knowledge of your support or your hidden inheritance, it looks exactly like the elder abuse she's alleging. So we provide the context," I said, opening my portfolio to reveal the complete documentation I'd been accumulating. The private investigator report proving they knew about my support. The estate records showing they hid my inheritance. The forensic accounting demonstrating her theft. Patricia studied the documents with growing amazement. "This is incredibly damaging to their case," she said finally. "But it's also incredibly damaging to them personally. If we present this evidence, your parents will face criminal investigation for hiding your inheritance, your sister will likely face fraud charges, and your family's reputation will be completely destroyed." "Their reputation was destroyed the moment they decided to publicly accuse me of elder abuse," I replied. "I tried to handle this privately, tried to let them face consequences without public humiliation. They chose to make this a media spectacle. Now they get to live with the consequences of that choice." But Patricia raised a concern that gave me pause. "Rachel, are you prepared for what happens after we win this case? Your parents are elderly, in poor health, and about to lose their house. Your sister will likely face criminal charges and financial ruin. You'll be vindicated, but you'll also be the daughter who destroyed her entire family's life in court. I walked to her office window overlooking Pioneer Square and watched people going about their ordinary lives, unaware that someone nearby was wrestling with the decision that would define the rest of her relationships with everyone she'd once called family. They destroyed their own lives, I said finally. I'm just the person who's finally going to stop preventing them from facing the consequences of their own choices. And you're comfortable with that? I thought about Christmas Eve, about standing in their dining room holding a dirty mop while they laughed at my humiliation. I thought about 8 years of secret sacrifices that had never been acknowledged. I thought about David Thornfield's inheritance, hidden for 2 years while I depleted my own savings to support people who were exploiting my generosity while knowing exactly where it came from. I'm comfortable with the truth, I said. Whatever consequences follow from the truth are consequences they earned through their own decisions. The battle for my reputation, my parents' freedom, and my family's future would be fought in a courtroom where lies and truth would finally face each other with no possibility of compromise or concealment. After 34 years of accepting their version of reality, I was finally going to present my own. The war was about to reach its climax, and this time, I had more than enough ammunition to win decisively. The courtroom in King County Superior Court was packed beyond capacity on February 28, with media representatives filling the back rows and community members from Millbrook Heights occupying every available seat. Judge Helena Morrison, a stern woman in her 60s known for her intolerance of theatrics, called the emergency guardianship hearing to order with a sharp rap of her gavel that silenced the murmuring crowd. Cassandra sat at the plaintiff's table beside Jonathan Blackwell, wearing a navy suit that projected competence and concern in equal measure. She'd transformed herself into the perfect image of a devoted daughter protecting vulnerable parents from exploitation, and I had to admire the precision of her performance even as I prepared to destroy it completely. Patricia Wells and I occupied the defendant's table, surrounded by boxes of evidence that would expose 34 years of family dysfunction with surgical precision. Behind us, Thomas sat in the front row beside Harrison Walsh, the estate executor who'd flown up from Portland to testify about my parents' deliberate concealment of my inheritance. Blackwell's opening statement was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation that painted me as a calculating predator who'd exploited elderly parents' trust for financial gain. Your Honor, we have a clear case of financial elder abuse perpetrated by a daughter who used her business expertise to systematically drain her parents' resources while convincing them she was helping them. He displayed charts showing money flowing from various charitable foundations into accounts associated with my business, carefully omitting the fact that those foundations had been created with my money to support my parents anonymously. He presented medical records documenting my mother's recent hospitalization, suggesting that her health crisis was directly related to the financial terrorism I'd inflicted through sudden withdrawal of support. The defendant abandoned these vulnerable elderly people the moment they could no longer serve her schemes, Blackwell concluded with dramatic flair. She left them to face medical emergencies and housing foreclosure while she expanded her business empire using money she'd extracted from their life savings. This is exactly the kind of predatory behavior our guardianship laws were designed to prevent. Patricia's opening was quieter but devastating in its implications. Your Honor, this case isn't about elder abuse. It's about a family's reaction to discovering that their unsuccessful daughter was actually a millionaire who'd been secretly supporting them for 8 years while they treated her with contempt and dismissal. She gestured toward our evidence boxes with calm confidence. We will prove that the plaintiffs knew about this support for years and chose to exploit it rather than acknowledge it. We will demonstrate that while Ms. Pemberton was sacrificing her own financial security to maintain their comfortable lifestyle, the plaintiff was systematically stealing from their parents through forgery and fraud. Most importantly, we will show that the parents deliberately concealed a $7 million inheritance that belonged to Ms. Pemberton while allowing her to believe she was financially struggling. The first witness Blackwell called was Dr. Robert Chin, a geriatric psychiatrist who'd never treated my parents but had reviewed their medical records and was prepared to testify about the psychological impact of financial abandonment on elderly individuals. His testimony was professional but clearly rehearsed, describing how sudden loss of financial support could trigger cognitive decline and decision-making impairment in vulnerable seniors. Patricia's cross-examination demolished his credibility with surgical precision. Dr. Chin, in your review of the medical records, did you find any documentation of cognitive decline or decision-making impairment in either parent prior to January of this year? Well, no, but the psychological trauma of financial abandonment can manifest quickly in elderly individuals. And are you aware that the parents hired a private investigator in 2020 to identify the source of their anonymous financial support? Dr. Chen's confusion was visible. No, that wasn't in the records I reviewed. So you weren't informed that they discovered the source of their support was their daughter, and chose to continue accepting it without acknowledgement for 4 additional years? I was not informed of that, no. Patricia presented the private investigator's report as evidence, and I watched the courtroom's attention shift as people began to understand that the narrative they'd been hearing was incomplete. Dr. Chen's testimony about vulnerable elderly people being suddenly abandoned became meaningless once it was established that those same elderly people had been knowingly exploiting their daughter's generosity for years. Cassandra took the stand next, and her performance was flawless, until Patricia began her cross-examination with questions about financial records that Cassandra clearly wasn't prepared to answer. Ms. Reynolds, are you familiar with the term mortgage refinancing? Of course, Cassandra replied confidently. Did you assist your parents with a refinancing of their home in 2019? I may have helped them with paperwork. I often help them with financial documents. Patricia presented the refinancing records, including the forged signatures that forensic analysis had proven weren't my father's handwriting. These documents show $120,000 being extracted from your parents' home equity and deposited into an account under your name. Can you explain that transaction? Cassandra's composure cracked visibly as she studied the documents. There must be some mistake. Those signatures look like my father's. Actually, according to forensic analysis, they don't look like your father's at all. They look like someone practiced copying his signature multiple times before executing these documents. The courtroom erupted as the implications became clear. Judge Morrison called for order while Cassandra tried desperately to explain why $120,000 from her parents' mortgage had ended up in her personal account. Her story shifted 3 times during questioning, first claiming she'd never seen the documents, then suggesting her father had asked her to manage the funds, finally insisting she'd been planning to return the money when her business succeeded. But Patricia's most devastating evidence came when she called Harrison Walsh to testify about David Thornfield's estate and my parents' deliberate concealment of my inheritance. The executor's testimony was clinical and damning, describing how my mother had intercepted all communications about a $7 million inheritance while watching me struggle financially to support them. Ms. Pemberton was legally entitled to this inheritance 2 years ago, Walsh testified. Her mother's interference prevented her from accessing resources that would have eliminated any financial stress related to supporting her family. The deceased specifically intended for these funds to give his daughter independence from people who were exploiting her generosity. When my father took the stand as Cassandra's final witness, I watched 20 years of suppressed guilt and shame finally surface under Patricia's relentless questioning. She walked him through 8 years of anonymous assistance he'd received, the private investigator report that had identified me as the source, and his decision to continue accepting my money while treating me as their unsuccessful daughter. Mr. Pemberton, when you handed your daughter a mop at Christmas dinner and told her to earn her keep, did you know she'd been paying your mortgage for 8 years? Yes, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Did you know she'd been covering your health insurance premiums? Yes. Did you know she'd been funding your grandchildren's private school education? Yes. And did you know that she had a $7 million inheritance that your wife was hiding from her? My father broke down completely then, sobbing in the witness chair as he admitted to exploiting my generosity while concealing my true financial situation from me. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as 34 years of family dysfunction collapsed under the weight of revealed truth. Judge Morrison's ruling was swift and unequivocal. She denied the guardianship petition with prejudice, finding no evidence of mental incapacity in my parents and substantial evidence of financial exploitation, but not by me. She ordered a criminal investigation into Cassandra's mortgage fraud and referred the inheritance concealment to the State Attorney General's office for potential prosecution. This court finds that Ms. Pemberton was the victim of systematic family exploitation, not its perpetrator, Judge Morrison declared. The evidence demonstrates years of anonymous generosity met with contempt, deliberate concealment of her inheritance while she sacrificed her own resources, and fraudulent theft by the very family member who brought this action. As we left the courthouse, I was surrounded by reporters shouting questions about my plans for my family relationships and my business expansion. But I ignored them all, focused instead on the future I was finally free to build without the weight of their expectations or exploitation. The transformation from humiliated daughter to vindicated millionaire was complete. Now came the most important part, turning their betrayal into purpose that would help thousands of other families escape the same kind of exploitation I'd finally learned to recognize and reject. The mop they'd handed me at Christmas had become the symbol of my liberation, and I was ready to show the world what that liberation could create. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.